So introduce you guys to some terms. Here is we have our hand wheel. And in this case, the hand wheel only moves towards us, and the inner wheel here we'll explore later when we talk about bobbin winding. A big one you'll need to know is your stitch length. So your stitch length, you have your 3, which is your standard stay stitch. And if you turn this dial down to a 5, you have your standard machine based. And depending on where else you go, you might explore different sizes when you're sewing buttonholes, when you're doing satin stitches. But in this case, we'll be sewing on a number 3. A lot of machines will have a variety of stitch lengths, which is how far between stitches as you go along the fabric. But know that a pretty good industry standard is a 2.5 or 3 for your regular stay stitch. Anything smaller is really hard to remove, and in theater, we often will do alterations and change sizes, and so if you're trying to unpick a size 1, you're going to hate life for a little while. And a size 5 or a stitch 5 is too big and could possibly rip. And so we tend to sew on a 2.5 or 3. So our stitch length here, in this case indicated by these dashed lines, gives us a range of stitch sizes. And on this model, you hold up the knob to do your reverse. Other machines might have a reverse button or might have another place to hold it. Often you'll see this backwards arrow or U-turn arrow as a way to indicate a reverse. And when we get into backstitching, we'll utilize that knob because backstitching is how you finish and begin all of your machine sewing, and it's how you basically would knot off your work. Up here we have 2 dials. This top one here of all these numbers, indicated by this zigzag icon right here, this turns right and left to become your stitch width or your zigzag. And you can see that as I turn that knob, it moves the needle placement right here. And so a 0 is no stitch width, which means straight stitch. But the more you go up in your numbers, the more your stitches will zigzag back and forth. But for today, for the first samples, we'll be doing a straight stitch, so we'll put it back to 0. This machine happens to have a knob that's preset for buttonholes, which can be really handy, and the 6 different steps will do the 6 different parts of the buttonhole satin stitching. All machines have the capability to do buttonholes, but often you might have to set those settings yourself. So I'm a huge fan of this Bernina and how it does the thinking for me. And then down here is the indicator on if we're having our tread dogs up or down to allow for a free stitching or for a guided stitching. And those tread dogs are right here underneath the presser foot. And those are the teeth that nyam 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 pull the fabric through after you've lowered your presser foot. And on this machine, because it has decorative stitches, you'll see there's a green line here and a red line here, and this knob is set to the green side. If you click it over to the red, it activates a different set of parameters. So if I click it over here for the green, on top of the machine, I have these different lists of decorative stitches. But because a lot of the work that we'll do in theater is done with a straight stitch or a zigzag, that's on this green side. So we get more often than not, we'll keep our machine over here if you have access to decorative stitches. Now on the other side of the machine, we start with our spool pins, which is where you'll put your spools of thread. And then we have our first thread guide. We'll meet that when I show you how to thread the machine. You have your uptake lever right here, which holds your thread. And you'll see that if I move the hand wheel, the uptake lever moves and controls the up and down motion of the needle itself. Here we have our needle, and it's in a center placement. And it goes down through the presser foot. And the presser foot lives on top of the throat plate. And in the back here, I'll go and I'll lift and lower the presser foot lever. Now the presser foot lever or lever is how you control the presser foot. And when you're working and putting your fabrics in place, you'll lift your presser foot up. And when you're ready to start sewing, you'll lower your presser foot down. And it's the tension between the presser foot and the throat plate here that allow for a lot more control of your fabric. If you accidentally start sewing with your presser foot up, the tension on your machine goes off, and you're just going to find a whole lot of bobbin art on the underside. So making sure, even if you're sewing with thick bulky fabrics to lower your presser foot, and that engages the internal tensions of the machine. Now this machine is called a front-loading bobbin. And so it has a bobbin pin right here. Some machines might have the bobbin casing up and they're what's called a drop top bobbin placement. But in the next section, I'll show you how to wind and load the bobbin as well. So before we thread this machine, I'll just show you how to wind a bobbin. So we have our bobbin holder right here. And I'm going to place this up on the bobbin spool right on the top of the machine. I'll click that in and then I'll lock it over. And moving that bobbin placement over engages in this machine the auto stop for when you fill up the bobbin. A lot of machines, as these bobbins will fill up, they'll hit a little bit of resistance, and once they hit that, they'll automatically stop because they're full. So in order to start that, I'll take my thread that's put onto the spool pin, and I'll go over to this little set of discs, and I'll click it in, and I'll wrap my thread from the front around the back and bring it back towards my bobbin right here. And then I'll thread from the inside up and out, so then that way my thread is going in between the two discs of my bobbin. Now I could just start winding my bobbin, but if I press the pedal, then it'll make my needle go up and down, which causes undue harm on the machine. So as you're winding a bobbin, you don't want the needle to be going up and down needlessly. So on this machine, I have to disengage the uptake lever, which means that the needle won't move. So I'm going to hold on to the outer ring of my hand wheel, and I'm going to loosen the inner wing so that it slackens. See how it's moving? So right now that's disengaged the uptake lever, which has disengaged the movement of that needle. So I'm going to hold on to my thread, because when I press the pedal on the floor and I don't have my thread held, it'll suck it back into the machine because the tension isn't being applied to anything. So I'll start hitting my pedal lightly. And then once this gets wound just a little bit, I'm actually going to pause and I'll trim my thread tails. If I keep holding on to this thread tail and then keep winding my bobbin, this whole thread could get sucked back in and get caught in the machine later on. So I'm going to trim that thread tail and then just keep winding. And you see how it automatically stopped when my spool got full. So now I can trim my threads and pop over my bobbin winding mechanism, and I can lift my bobbin up and off, and then I'll retighten my hand wheel. So holding the outer wheel and then tightening the smaller one away from myself. So then that way you guys can see that I've re-engaged the uptake lever that'll move my needle. So I'm holding my bobbin so that the thread is wrapping from the underside up and over to my right. So when I go to put it into the bobbin casing, and then I can click it into this little cut in the casing, and then double back so that I come through that opening in the top of the bobbin. When I pull my bobbin, you see how it's moving clockwise? That's the directionality you want it to go. So then I can open up my bobbin casing, and in this case, this bobbin holder has a little arm on it that acts as a brake. So if I were to move and drop this around, my bobbin is nice and secure because I've engaged the brake on it. But that won't let me put it onto the peg in there. So either you have to let go once you get it onto the peg inside your machine, or you can tilt your bobbin a little bit upwards so that it's angled when you go in there, and making sure that your thread is over your hand and doesn't get caught between the bobbin and its casing. So you'll place it in and then you press it till you hear a light click. That can be satisfying. And then you'll leave this open and your thread out until you get your machine threaded. So lifting up my presser foot, I'm going to prep my thread. It's still on those thread spools. And I'll go into this first thread guide that shoots me forward into this trough. This trough points down so I can go around this other thread guide. And then I'll go in and loop it around my uptake lever. What's important is that there's a little cut back here that allows for you to swoop it around. Machines are meant to be threaded quickly and one-handedly, and so if you're struggle bussing to get it to work, chances are you're just missing the little slit that will allow you to scoop your thread in. So now that I've scooped my thread into that uptake lever, there's one more thread guide right above the needle. And then we're going to cut away at this next part because I'm not going to be able to thread this without blocking the shot. All right, so I'm going to thread my needle and be back so I can show you guys how to finish this off. For this last step of pulling up my bobbin thread, in my left hand, I'm going to hold my top thread nice and tight. And then with my right hand, I'm going to start pulling this wheel towards me. You don't want to go too slow. It should be a fluid motion, but you're going to dip the needle down, maintaining pressure with your left hand so that it jumps around the bobbin casing and pulls up that bottom thread. And then with your fingers or some snips, you can go ahead and pull all your threads off to the side. And then once you've closed your bobbin casing, you're ready to start sewing. So this first machine sample will be of the straight stay stitch. So we've set our machine to be on a 0 zigzag, so no zig at all, and then a number 3, which is a good median stay stitch. So I've just ruled some lines down the center of these scraps of fabric just to give myself something to follow with. So as I look at my throat plate, something to note are the different lines that indicate specific markers. So on your presser foot, you have a cut that is this center piece right here, and that indicates your needle placement. And so when you're in center position, if you line up your stitch line on that cut or indent on your presser foot, then you're sewing directly on your line. The other thing to know is that you have some measurements already built into the machine. So from that center placement to the inside edge of your presser foot leg is 1/8 of an inch. To the outside edge of your presser foot is 1/4 inch, so 2 1/8, 1/4 inch. And then for all of these lines on either side of your presser foot along the throat plate are different 1/8 incrementations. So this first one is 3/8, this second one is 1/2 inch, this third one, in this case on the Bernina, it happens to be the first long line, is 5/8, and then 3/4, 7/8, and 1 inch. So when you're working, if you don't have a stitch line to follow, if you line up the edge of your fabric with a 5/8 line or a 1/2 inch line, you are sewing with a 1/2 inch or 5/8 seam allowance. So first thing I'll do is I'll put my fabric underneath my presser foot, and then using the presser foot lever in the back here, I'll lower my presser foot in place. We don't slap it down. A lot of domestic machines might actually have plastic parts on the inside, and the more that you snap any of your levers, the more likely you are to break it over time. So now if I were to just start pressing the pedal on the floor, my threads would get sucked back up into the machine because there's no tension being applied to them. So for these first few stitches, you want to hold on to both of your threads, either in one hand like this, or you can use a finger and hold your fabric and your threads at the same time. But pushing that pedal, I'll take a few stitches forward, and once I'm done that, then I won't worry about holding my threads anymore. But now, if I were just to keep on stitching, this seam or this stitch line could come out. So I'm actually going to engage the reverse lever to do my back stitch. So I lift up the reverse lever that we saw earlier in the video, and I'll back stitch to the beginning of my seam or to where I lowered my presser foot onto the fabric in the first place. And then I'll come forward one more time to start my seam, and it's that back and forth that really sets the knot or sets the beginning of that seam. And as you're sewing, the fabric is being pulled into the machine, so there's not really a need to necessarily push it through, but using your hands to kind of keep it steady and to keep feeding so that your thread and your needle are hitting on that stitch line. But before you finish, you'll go ahead and you'll back stitch just to finish your seam. So I'm lifting up that back stitch, that reverse lever, taking 3 or 4 stitches, about 1/4 to a 1/2 inch. You don't have to go too crazy. And then I'll come back to the end of my presser foot. Now, a thing to note before you lift your fabric off of the machine is to make sure that your uptake lever is all the way lifted, and you'll actually use your wheel to move it forward so that the uptake lever goes all the way up, and that's how you know that your stitch is completed. If you've ever lifted up your presser foot and gone to pull your threads and pull your fabric and you get some resistance, it's because the uptake lever hasn't completed its last stitch, and you're actually forcing the machine to do something that it doesn't want to do. And then when you're done, some machines have a built-in blade that allow you just to trim your threads, or having some snips nearby is helpful as well. Machine zigzag is also a good technique to learn. And much like stay stitching to basting, zigzagging also has a range of sizes. So right now I'm going to turn my machine to be a 3 stitch length and then a 3 zigzag, just so that you guys can see the middle of the road basting. And depending on what you're doing, zigzagging can be used to zigzag over a heavier cord to gather down something bulkier. A zigzag at a very small stitch might create a satin stitch and a way to edge something. Or you might use it for machine darning or decorative works. So similar to my basting and machine stay stitching, I'll place my fabric so that the presser foot lines up with that stitch line that I've drawn. I'll hold my threads when I start, and I will backstitch this one just in case. And so what you'll see is the needle, instead of moving forward, the needle will move side to side as it moves forward along that line. And how far it moves forward is dictated by the stitch length, and how far apart or wide it goes is dictated by the zigzag width. So making sure my needle is in the up position, I'll take a pause and I'll adjust those settings. So right now I'm going to lower my stitch length to a 1, and I'll keep my zigzag on a 3. And then I'll try one more option, but before I adjust anything, I'll make sure my needle is all the way out of the fabric and that my uptake lever is in the up position. If you make any adjustments to your width, you see how the needle could move as I move that wheel? If it's caught in the fabric, it could tear or harm or bind up. And so for this last bit, I'm going to set my zigzag to the largest that I have, a 5, and I'll set my stitch length to the largest that I have, also a 5. And I'll finish off my zigzag sample. And then before I finish, I'll do some backstitching just to end. So you can see on the zigzag sample, right here is our 3 length with our 3 width, staying at a 3 width but going down to a 1 length, and those stitches will stack up closer together. At the very end, we're going to increase everything and go to a 5 zig and a 5 length, and you make the largest zigzag possible.